Welcome back to Of Gods and Game Masters. I am your host, Jack Kellum. You can find me all over the internet at ofgodsandgamemasters.com, Jack Gogsbane, all those sorts of things. Today we're talking about world building with Ancestries and Monsters. Everything you choose or make for your world, or even for a campaign in that world, or someone else's world, from the simplest NPC to the dungeons and the crypts, to the accents the characters use, to curating spells, ancestries, and the like, what to include, what not to include. That's all world building. Today, we're going to examine ancestry and monster choice or creation, including the origins of ancestries and monsters, their abilities, their place in the world, and what all that says about both those monsters and the world they fit into. It's a major thrust of my alternate ecology series on my blog to examine exactly how monsters fit into the ecology and cosmology of the world. And it's definitely important to remember that the effects go both ways. The nature of the world you're working in, whether you made it or not, affects the kind of creatures that live there. Conversely, those creatures, once you've made them, will have effects on the world around them, and other things will act or change in response. So let's get into it. I'll be using the successor states of Rhaegar and maybe some of my other worlds in my examples again, but I don't really need to get into the weeds about the setting any further than I have. I've been sort of wandering off the point and just talking about my world, less than teaching how to make one, and I'll try to do a better job with that going forward. Choose the ancestries or races you want to use in your game very carefully. These especially will set the tone for much of your game. A setting where you can be any fantasy creature that D&D or other tabletop role-playing games have thought up in the last 50 years is going to feel, at best, crowded and inconsistent, because not all those creatures are really compatible on the same world. Definitely keep this in mind when choosing your monsters. The ancestries and monsters together will be more interesting if there are known interactions between certain types of monsters and the types of beings that PCs can be. Note that a limited choice is not bad in any way and can help focus campaign or setting themes and mood. Don't try to fit everything in unless you want a disjointed but also cosmopolitan and maybe plane hopping kind of feel. It's totally okay to let people be anything when playing Planescape, for instance. Anywho, let's get back on topic. Take a look at Rhaegar when it comes to ancestries. The successor states of Rhaegar allows all the ancestries in the 2014 Player's Handbook of D&D, except for Dragonborn, Gnomes, and Half-Orcs. Why? Well, in Rhaegar, gnomes were never created. The closest thing you'll find is a subtype of halflings called underhills, and they aren't crafters and miners. One of the reasons for that is that it maintains a distinction between them and the dwarves, which can get muddled when you throw in gnomes. As for half-orcs, this actually ties right into the monster choices. Rhaegar doesn't have orcs at all, and the goblin folk, or koboloi, are a variety of beings who are still technically biologically members of the main species, twisted by magic. With no orcs and other creatures in their niche, there's no place for half-orcs. Instead of half-orcs or dragonborn, at least in the basic player ancestries, we have a different entry, the Spartoi. They are metallic humanoids crafted from the teeth of the metallic dragons in the First Age. They kind of fit the big, strong ancestry mold, and they take the place of orcs, dragonborn, and Goliaths all at once, for player characters, at least. But they also have a unique flavor and purpose in the world. They were made by the gods to oppose the dragon spawn, like kobolds and dragonborn, that come from chromatic dragons. And those chromatic dragons were made by the dark gods as living siege weapons. Now, I might put out a book later where one can be dragonborn, which are called Draconai or Dracone in the setting, or kobold, called Draconaki, but at base, most of them are under the control of the evil dragons and thus mostly bad guys. So it makes sense to put them out later in an Outcast book or something rather than have them available to folks that are focusing on uncomplicated heroic adventure and maybe they don't want to deal with fantasy racism. Now, I added in new elf and dwarf and halfling subtypes, and there are rarer ancestries like the Skyloi, or dogfolk, and the Chaosborn, which are folks descended from some denizen of primordial chaos. But the main 5 choices are humans, dwarves, elves, halflings, and Spartoi. It gives a classic array, a good variety, but not so much it feels muddled. The last race makes the whole setting feel more mythic, less stereotypical generic fantasy. Tieflings and Aasimar, or as Tales of the Valiant calls them, Siderians, exist, by the way, but mostly they're just considered members of their other ancestry, despite their powers. And I merged the abilities of their base ancestry with the Siderian or Tiefling or Aasimar to work out what they can do. Crossbreeding with gods, demigods, etc. is just kind of a fact of life in a Greco-Roman mythologically inspired setting. So I chose the 5 main ancestries for a feel, to cross familiar fantasy with a little bit of a deep mythological feel, and to very clearly set up the dynamic of the setting. Each one of these types of folks have their own relations with the other beings of their world. Spartoi are born and bred to fight dragons and dragon spawn. And although they can certainly choose another path for themselves, a certain perspective on the draconic races is heavily culturally inculcated in them. All 5 of these peoples have their own specific counterpart among the koboloi, which means rogues in Greek, aka the goblin folk, because the koboloi were literally created when the dark gods intentionally twisted members of each of those races into mockeries of themselves. Even the koboloi aren't inherently evil, by the way, but it's hard to be good when the dark gods infect you with some kind of weird curse thing. The koboloi are genetically, biologically still members of their original species. Goblins are still halflings, hobgoblins are still dwarves, bugbears are still Spartoi, plagueborn are still human. Serpent folk are still elves, and that's an interesting one because they're my setting's equivalent to drow. They're the elves that fell to the dark by choice, by being corrupted by the dark gods, and they're a very different approach to the dark elf trope. So there becomes an interesting dynamic between the koboloi and their counterparts, and this also greatly affects what the world will look like. What racism there is in the setting is directed at 2 specific groups. One, the koboloi, who are not a race or even a species, but rather twisted members of other species that are in many ways victims. While prejudice toward them might well be both ableist and truly horrible, it is to a certain extent understandable. It's more like a prejudice against, say, vampires or werewolves, which are both people, often innocent people, who've been infected or cursed with a condition that invariably drives them to evil acts, than it is racism per se. The other is more legitimately considered racism. There are a very few dragon spawn who have broken free of their dragon queens, and some of them are good of heart. But the vast majority of them are enslaved servitors, many of whom don't realize there are other options. They're almost part of a hive mind. In many ways, the dragon spawn of Rhaegar are more like drones, workers, and soldiers of a hive, in which the dragon is the queen, as you can see in my updated version of Alternate Ecology of Dragons. Once again, many of them don't even really have free will, and some manage to break free. But to the people of the successor states, they're simply monsters. There is a dichotomy there because the people of Rhaegar pride themselves on being tolerant and cosmopolitan. They have no sex or gender-based discrimination, no solidly fixed gender roles. Among the 5 main ancestries of dwarves, elves, halflings, humans, and Spartoi, there's no discrimination based on those races or ancestries. It just doesn't occur to them mostly because of their gods and the open-minded teaching of their gods. However, people tend to have a real trouble being tolerant and open-minded when faced with someone that looks like a thing that hurt them and continues to threaten them. And the Koboloi and the Dragonspawn are the primary foot soldiers of the Dark Gods. The Dark Gods expressly wish to destroy the world of Telus, or Telluria, and everyone in it. All of these truths exist because of conscious design choices while building my Ancestries and Monsters, and they make Rega a place that feels much more real. That verisimilitude. It doesn't end with intelligent creatures either. Having established that there are pools of Invidian blood, the ancient evil chaos entity that was destroyed at the beginning. There are pools of this Invidian blood just lying around on Telus from when it was slain by the storm god. It gave me a clear origin for most of the monsters of the world. They represent, in most cases, normal creatures warped by the chaotic and evil influence of that blood, made into monsters by horrific mutation, and many of them are driven as much by pain, the pain of their existence, as they are anger or hunger or evil. So that told me that making a lot of the monsters was going to be like the medieval mix and match monsters, right? The various types of chimera and the combo critters that are so common in Greek and other myth. Or was it the other way around? I mean, maybe the blood came up as an explanation of why there are so many things out there that are weird combinations or mutations of other critters. Either way, the cause and the critter both expand the world and its rules and suppositions. You can check out my blog post on the origin of monsters for more about that. On a more prosaic level, the Doylist level outside the fiction, the kind of monsters you make or choose to use affect the setting and the narrative profoundly. Imagine a few fantasy settings, right? All of them are generic Anglo-centric fantasy worlds, but one has as its primary monsters a species of intelligent humanoids like orcs. Maybe there are a variety of kinds of orc and a few other monsters around the edges, like a few undead, a couple of dragon things, a nameless horror, but mostly it's orcs. Another uses mainly non-humanoid monsters, especially, say, dragon types. A third only has human fighters, human magic wielders, and undead, with like 3 dragons ever. All of these are very different worlds, different games, different settings, even if every other single thing about them is the same. Different threats mean different worlds, different ways societies have formed to face those threats, different architecture. In the dragon world, if almost all of your enemies can fly, you don't have castles with open courtyards. Your fortresses are pyramids or domes. Of course, if they aren't that common, maybe your culture doesn't adapt completely, but you will have specialists in dealing with dragons. If you face orcish hordes all the time, you have a use for normal castles, but you have to have folks regularly patrolling to catch all the raiding parties. In the world with mostly human foes and then a dragon or two and the undead, everything looks a lot more like medieval Europe, up until the time the undead get into big groups, and suddenly folks have to deal with that. I've just described The Lord of the Rings, Dragonbane by Barbara Hambly, and Game of Thrones. They have the same Anglo-centric backdrop, but they are totally different worlds because of monster choice and because of racial or ancestry choice. So when world building, don't just throw in everything and the kitchen sink. Curate and choose your ancestries and monsters carefully. They can change everything, and your players or readers will appreciate the depth and consistency of tone and theme.